This is a very simple section, nothing too difficult. I want to introduce you to moral pluralism and make a case that we should be moral pluralists. Now, many people will find this very straightforward and uncontroversial, but if my past experience is anything to go by, there will be some people who find this interestingly challenging. So as you remember, my overall question is whether cultural differences in moral psychology explain political conflict on climate change. And in order to answer that question, I'm working through a single paper by Feinberg and Willer, which attempts to give a positive answer to that question. Now, the second of 5 claims that we will study from that paper concerns the idea that there are more than one fundamental domains of human morality. Now, they say 5. That's, I think, very unimportant. The crucial thing is whether or not you think there's one or you think there's many. How you count them is really very uninteresting, I think. So why should we accept pluralism? Why should we accept that there are more than one domain of moral property, as Feinberg and Willer put it? Or as I would say, why should we accept that when we're making moral judgments, there are types of concern that are incommensurable with each other? Concern with purity, for example, and a concern with harm. Why should we accept that? Now, just at the beginning here, I want to introduce a caveat. And the caveat is that we are not thinking about a normative claim here. So we're not thinking there's something wrong with a theory like consequentialism that says the rightness or wrongness of an action is to do with the harm caused by its actions. That would be a monist rather than a pluralist theory, but that's, I take it, a normative theory. Our concern is with the descriptive. How is it that humans typically think? If we're trying to describe ordinary thinking about ethical issues, about moral problems, if we're trying to think about morally relevant actions, do we need to be pluralists, or is it okay to be monistic, right? To have a monistic theory. So let me illustrate by contrasting. I think the easiest part of this to grasp is actually a contrast between harm and purity. So let me start there. You could be given, this is from a study by Shackroff that I'll tell you about in a second, you could be given a harm situation. So Roderick intentionally punches someone in the ribs. That would be, I take it, paradigm example of harming. And here, Roderick intentionally poured a cup of urine into his own lap. Ooh, right? So here, in a sense, Roderick isn't really harming anybody. It doesn't look like he's harming anybody anyway. But there is a violation for many people of something that counts as a morality, right? So many people would say this is an immoral act. This is an immoral act, although by design there is no harm. So I take it that if Shackroff and colleagues are right, that harm and purity are 2 quite different ways in which people evaluate moral transgressions, then we would be inclined to accept moral pluralism. Because if we wanted to reject moral pluralism, it's very unlikely that we could find, and go for a mono version, it's very unlikely that we could find an attribute that would allow us to make sense of the idea that people distinguish these 2 different kinds of violation. Let's look at Shackroff and colleagues' evidence. So what they did, of course, is to fill in the square. So here you see we were contrasting harm towards somebody else with a purity violation directed towards oneself. What they do, of course, they have this very nice 2x2 design. They consider harm caused to oneself, punching yourself in the ribs, and purity violations involving another person, pouring urine onto another person's lap. Now, this is a complicated and quite deep study, and I'm not telling you about the main part of the study. I actually just want to use a small part of this study to illustrate that there seem to be patterns in the way that people make judgments that require us to accept moral pluralism. So Shackroff and colleagues, about each of these scenarios, asked their subjects 4 questions. So one of them was about naturalness. How much does this violate the natural order of things? How unnatural is it? How disgusted do you feel about it? And those 2 were actually grouped together. How damaging is this? And how angry do you feel about it? And those, again, were grouped together. And their prediction was, well, they had lots of predictions, actually. The prediction that I'm interested in was this. Their prediction was that people would tend to think that the other directed cases are cases of harm, whereas the self-directed cases are cases which involve purity. And you can see that here in part of their results. So Here are the other directed actions versus the self-directed actions. And what you can see overall is that people tended to regard the other directed actions as scoring very highly on harm, that's the light bars, compared to the self-directed actions. Even punching oneself in the stomach is not particularly supposed to be very harmful. Whereas when we look at the purity, how unnatural is the action, people don't think that punching another person in the stomach is at all unnatural. In fact, they think it's relatively natural, right? But of course it's much more unnatural to pour urine into your lap or to punch yourself. So people think. So here's what they comment. Participants judged other directed acts to be more harmful than impure and also more harmful compared to self-directed acts. And somewhat conversely, it's not quite as strong in the converse direction, but somewhat conversely. Why am I excited? I'm wondering whether I need to be a moral pluralist or not. What I find is that Shackroff and colleagues can distinguish a harm issue from a purity issue, and they can find pattern in people's judgments, and they can see that different factors tend to affect whether something's a harm violation or a purity violation. So that self-other dimension seems to be relevant to people in deciding whether or not they're dealing with a violation of a violation involving a harm, or violation involving impurity. Now in a follow-up study, this is a different study, they find that people expect others who commit purity violations later to go on and harm others, but they don't expect the converse. They don't expect people who harm other people to go on and commit purity violations. So again, it looks like there are some interesting patterns in people's ordinary reasoning that can be neatly explained on a hypothesis involving moral pluralism. There are at least two kinds of moral attributes that people are after, one involving harm, one involving purity. It's very difficult to accept that without. So the question was, why should we accept descriptive pluralism? And I take it that Shackroff and colleagues give us a good answer to that question, because we seem to need some kind of pluralism in order to explain patterns in people's ordinary moral judgments. But you know what, it's more interesting than that. The story doesn't stop here. So it could end there. I mean, in a sense, that would be okay. But there's much more to say. And in order to say that, I want to introduce you to a basic distinction which comes up again and again in the literature. So it's very difficult, I think, to be, as a moral pluralist, to say, well, what exactly is going on? Right? What exactly are the different categories of moral value? I think we don't have a good theory of that, to be honest. I think there's a lot of room for debate about the details. But what seems to be fairly robust is a distinction between individual type values, so these are to do with harm and cheating, and what are sometimes called binding values. So these are thought to be binding because they're supposed to link people together. So these are issues about betrayal, issues about subversion, being subversive, and issue about impurity. Now, some people will be saying to me, Steve, look, I don't think this subversion thing is a moral issue. Aha, right? But there are differences. There are cultural differences in what does and what doesn't count as a moral issue. So what we're trying to do here, in a way, is to provide a framework that will allow us to recognise that there are differences between individuals and between cultures in what does count as a moral violation and what doesn't count as a moral violation. So we should be careful here. It's not for us to make a judgment about what counts as a moral issue or not. It's for us to discover how people make the distinction between moral and non-moral and try to understand the patterns in that. The claim that we've just seen is that in order to understand patterns in what people take as moral versus non-moral violations, we need to be pluralist, and in particular we need at least a distinction between something like individual values and binding values. Let's go a bit further here. Let's try to illustrate. So there's something called the Moral Foundations Questionnaire that we'll look at a little bit later. And one way in which the Moral Foundations Questionnaire is applied is by giving people a list of statements and asking how strongly they reject, neutral, or accept those statements, right? So they can mark themselves on a scale in response to each of these things. And some of the items on that questionnaire concern harm. So I'm just trying to illustrate here for you what sort of thing would be regarded as harm related. These would be regarded as harm related, right? Killing. And by contrast, these four items are used in the Moral Foundations Questionnaire to track purity. So people should not do things that are revolting to others, even if no one is harmed. And the idea is this, that if you find yourself in strong agreement with that, that's a sign that you are somebody who thinks that purity is more morally important than, all things being equal, than somebody who marks low on that kind of question. Now, exactly whether these questions work and whether the questions really do pick out a kind of distinct moral aspect is an open question, and one that we should take carefully. So I'm not for the moment saying that I'm prepared just to take that for granted. I'm merely trying to illustrate the sorts of concern that people might express which could be classified as purity rather than harm related. And you can see here, it looks like there's a kind of confound here, for example, with religion, with that reference to sin, and it's unclear whether or not that involves a clear distinction between harm. So there's a lot of work to be done here, but hopefully the items give you a sense of how the harm-purity distinction is supposed to go. All right, very good. Now, I was mentioning all this because I want to tell you about pathogens. The idea is very simple. We know on the one hand that we need to distinguish between harm issues and purity issues in order to keep track of patterns in people's moral judgments. But some people might say, well, look, it's really only harm that counts, and all of this other stuff is just so much kind of, politically correct fluff or whatever. Right? So much politically correct fluff, we haven't really got time for people who emphasize purity. But there's another reason why we should be moral pluralists, and that's because in evolutionary history, different communities have faced quite different environments and challenges, and the moral psychology involved in those communities and the culture has adapted accordingly. One very nice illustration of this is a study which looked at two things. So it looked at, first of all, where do you live? Where do you live? And is that a location which historically there have been relatively few pathogens? So you imagine, for example, somewhere which is extremely cold, right? Will have far less of a challenge from pathogens than somewhere that's very hot. So that would be one factor. So anyway, where you live, is it that there were very few pathogens in your environment, or is it that pathogens were a major problem? And this is relevant because in evolutionary time, pathogens were one of the key challenges that humans have faced, particularly from the point at which they started to eat meat. So humans don't have the kind of immune system that a vulture has. A vulture can put its head up the bum of a dead animal and eat it from the inside, right? Whereas humans would surely die if they did that kind of thing. But humans are still trying to essentially make use of some of the same food sources without the immune system. So pathogens have been a very big problem for humans historically, but how much of a problem has of course varied from place to place. Now, the other thing they did was they worked out for each of their respondents, in addition to where they were, to what extent those respondents tended to endorse binding foundations, so purity, loyalty and the rest, or tended to minimise them. And what you can see here very clearly, so there is a regression analysis, but you actually don't need that. What you can see here, it's beautiful, is that there's a very clear correlation between sticking to the binding foundations, which are relevant for dealing with pathogens. Pathogens, of course, are harmful, but people didn't know that, right, until relatively recently. So the binding foundations are the relevant way to deal with pathogens and the historical prevalence of pathogens. Very nice study. What's this telling us? Well, the question here is why we should accept pluralism. Why should we accept pluralism? Part of the answer to that is, look, historically humans have faced different challenges. Their ethical abilities have allowed them to respond to those challenges. For example, taboos and moralising around hygiene practices have allowed humans to deal with pathogens in one way or another. But the challenges they face have been different, and so their moral psychologies have been different accordingly. That's very difficult to explain, I think, on a monist view, easy to explain on a pluralist view, which accepts a rough distinction between purity-like aspects of morality and harm-like aspects of morality. You're sceptical about that last study. I did skip over something very important. The researchers here had a very large sample, so they were able to control for individual variations in political orientation, gender, education and age. And that's important, of course, because you might think that what's happening here is you've got some crude effects. Geography is telling you something about education, or it's telling you something about politics, and that's influencing what's causing these responses, but it's not. So this is actually a reasonably robust result. If you live in an area which was historically much more susceptible to pathogens, they were much more of a threat, you're more likely all things being equal, to be part of a culture that puts more emphasis on, loyalty, respect for authority, purity, and the rest. All right, so we should accept descriptive pluralism is my suggestion, because it allows us to explain patterns in ordinary judgments, that with Shakarov and colleagues, and because it allows us to understand how humans have adapted to survive in different environments by changing their moral psychology. But there's a third type of argument that we find from the anthropologist Graham and his colleagues. So they say purity judgments predict important thoughts and behaviours over and above harm judgments. For instance, purity concerns uniquely predict culture war attitudes about gay marriage, euthanasia, abortion, and pornography. They also predict opposition to stem cell research, environmental attitudes, that of course will be important for us particularly later in this lecture and next week's, lawsuits, and also social distancing. So this is a very simple argument, but when we're faced with a passage like this, the right thing for us to do is, of course, not to take their words at face value, but to check out some of these sources. So I wanted to check out Koleva and colleagues' 2012 paper. I think that's very interesting, but it's also a very rich paper, so I wanted to focus in particular on some research which has since been supported and followed up in other studies, and this is research on attitudes to homosexuality. Attitudes to homosexuality. This is called a very important practical issue because there are many countries in the world, I think currently 14, where you can legally be killed for having sex with somebody of the same gender. 14 countries in the world where it's actually legal for you to be killed for having sex with someone in the same gender. And I think of those 14 countries, something like 7 countries have in recent history executed people for homosexual activity. That's a very striking finding. So we want some insight into this, right? So if you were thinking, it would be nice actually to change attitudes and to save some lives, it'd be quite good then to understand something about the causes of these attitudes as well. So an important piece of background is that people who identify as more socially conservative tend to exhibit stronger homophobia. Now you might think that's sort of almost true by definition, right? But actually, social conservative versus socially liberal, there's a whole range of things that go together, and so it's not completely trivial to understand what's part of that and what isn't part of that. Anyway, this is part of it. Now the question is why? Why is that? And one natural thought, especially if you think about countries where the death penalty tends to be invoked, often there's a religious justification of that. You might think, well, it would be what's explaining this is religion. People who are more socially conservative tend to be more religious, and religions tend to prohibit homosexuality. Many of the world's organised religions apparently do. But I think we should be very sceptical about this for a very simple reason. This is really just anecdotal, but the Semitic religions are monotheistic religions, even though in a book that all of those Semitic religions recognise as an important piece of scripture, there's a very clear story about demigods who come down to earth and mate with human females, right? They took the ones they liked, it says in Genesis. They took the ones they liked. I love that passage. So what this tells us is that people who adhere to a religion have various ways of dealing with texts and interpreting them, so that even though a text might not appear on the face of it to be monotheistic, you can get a monotheistic religion out of it. Likewise, if you look at the practice of lending money for interest, that's very clearly prohibited in a wide range of scriptures, but of the religions that use those scriptures, that take those books as scripture, for the most part, many of them, not all of them, but many of them actually completely disregard that. So you've got to ask yourself, why is it that the religious practices accept some things and reject others? It can't be driven by the religion itself. I think what we should probably accept here is this. The religion provides a mechanism by which you can sustain homophobia, can be an effective way to sustain homophobia, but we can't understand the origins of homophobia by appeal to the religion itself, right? It must be something else that's driving the religious practice to be a force which then sustains homophobia. So we want a deeper understanding of what's going on. One possibility here, and I wouldn't want to say, this is a very important issue, very high stakes. So what we're looking for is a potential explanation, but we need to be extremely cautious here because, of course, lives are at stake. One possibility is that we can explain why people who identify as more socially conservative tend to exhibit stronger homophobia by looking at cultural differences in morality. So there are 3 studies that have attempted to do that. They're all in the notes below. I think the most careful is Barnett and colleagues, but what I would note is that the 3rd study, Liu and colleagues, looked at an entirely different sample. So there's nice cross-cultural, not comparison, but cross-cultural replication, if you like, not exactly replication, but close to replication cross-culturally. And what Barnett essentially did, this is a model that doesn't exactly illustrate it, they took the political ideology, the social political ideology, they looked at how much of that directly explains homophobic attitudes, strength of homophobic attitudes, but they also looked at to what extent that those attitudes are mediated either by the binding foundations, concern like purity, or by the individual foundations, concern like harm. And this is important because when you look at homophobic discourse, a lot of that stresses harm as well as issues of purity. It seems to appeal to both kinds of moral foundation. What they found in short was that political ideology has an indirect on homophobia most consistently through the binding foundations. So the idea is that it's not the political ideology itself, it's the binding foundations. Why is this important? Well, it might be important practically, right? It might be important practically. So it might be that a little bit of anthropology and social psychology can provide ways and ideas about how homophobia can be countered and some of its effects can be mitigated. And that would be important, but that's well beyond the scope of anything that we're doing in this section or on this course even. So I want to put that aside and turn to something which is important but less exciting. And that's the question, why should we accept descriptive moral pluralism? The thought is, what we've seen, it matches patterns in ethical judgments. Why do people think that, for example, self things are likely to be to do with impurity, whereas other directed actions are likely to cause harm? It's linked to specific kinds of moral concern having a particular role in evolution, for example, enabling humans to deal with pathogens. And it's needed to explain how cultural differences in moral psychology underpin attitudes to homosexuality. So I think we have some quite strong reasons for accepting moral pluralism, and that's a further step towards understanding the role of cultural differences in moral psychology in explaining political conflicts.